So what happens when a deposed leader gets to write their own story? Today, we're diving into an absolutely fiery political manifesto written from exile by one of Latin America's most polarizing figures, Juan Perón. This is his side of the story, in his own words, and it's his battle to control the narrative against the very people who kicked him out of power.
Okay, so the title of his book, written just a year after he was overthrown, translates to "Force is the right of the beasts." You can tell right from the cover he wasn't just defending his legacy, he was on the attack. He's basically framing his enemies as nothing more than animals who used brute force to crush the will of the people.
And Perón kicks off this whole thing not with a personal plea, but by positioning himself as the sole bearer of truth. He says this book is his moral obligation, a duty he has to the Argentine people and to the whole world, really, to expose what he calls a massive, systematic campaign of lies being waged by the new military dictatorship.
So what exactly was he defending himself from? Well, according to Perón, the new regime had a pretty big problem. He argues they couldn't find a single legitimate thing wrong with his actual policies, so they went a different route, straight-up character assassination, inventing personal scandals to justify what he calls an unjustifiable revolution.
In his telling, the case against him was just a total spectacle, not a real legal process at all. He describes these dramatic raids on his private homes, where they'd catalog all of his personal belongings for the press to see. He argues this had nothing to do with justice. It was a PR campaign, a show designed to humiliate him and cut that deep, deep connection he had with the Argentine people.
All right, so after spending all this time tearing down the accusations as nothing but slander, Perón pivots. And this is the main event, his defense of the Argentina that he built. He paints this incredibly stark before and after picture of his decade in power. He creates this really powerful contrast, right? On one side, he describes this dependent colony, a society made up of, in his own unforgettable words, fat bulls and skinny laborers. And on the other side, the nation he claims to have created, economically independent, running on social justice, and with its most important national assets finally back in Argentine hands.
And he starts backing this all up with some pretty wild numbers. He goes right for the wallet of the average worker. He claims that while salaries shot up 500%, his government kept the cost of living increase to just 250%. The result? A massive 50% boost in real wages. But it wasn't just about money. He paints this incredible picture of social progress. I mean, look at this list. 8,000 new schools, housing for 500,000 families, and a public health revolution that he says completely wiped out malaria and slashed deaths from tuberculosis. You can see why this was the bedrock of his popular support.
But maybe the most vivid story in the entire book is how he says he retook Argentina's national assets. He zooms in on the saga of the British-owned railways, and he frames it as an absolute masterclass in high-stakes, bare-knuckle negotiation.
His main negotiator, a guy named Miguel Miranda, immediately set this incredibly confrontational tone. The British asked for 10 billion pesos. Miranda's response, he basically laughs, calls their entire railway system a pile of old iron, and offers just 1 billion. It was such a lowball offer, it was basically a calculated insult. Perón lays this whole thing out like a 5-act play. First, you have the insulting offer. The British storm off. But then, pressure from the railway workers forces them back to the table. And here's the twist. Perón claims they tried to offer his negotiator a massive secret bribe. But instead of taking it, Miranda uses it as leverage to drive the price down even further. And the final checkmate? He pays for it all with Argentine wheat that he sold to the British at a 200% markup. Meaning, in his telling, he got the entire railroad system without spending a single centavo.
Now, these huge projects weren't just random policies. They were all part of a unique political philosophy that Perón developed and championed. He called it Justicialism.
He's very clear that this isn't some rigid academic political theory. He describes it more as a philosophy of life. He presents Justicialism as this uniquely Argentine solution, something simple, practical, and deeply human, that's always searching for that perfect sweet spot between individual rights and the needs of the whole community.
He positions this idea as a third position, a third way that rejects what he saw as the two broken systems that were dominating the Cold War. For him, capitalism was just the exploitation of man by capital, and communism was the exploitation of the individual by the state. Justicialismo, he argued, was the only humane alternative to either one.
This line right here, it's one of his famous 20 Truths of Justicialism, and it just perfectly captures the populist, people-first appeal of his whole ideology. It's a simple, powerful slogan that you can see why it resonated so deeply with his working-class base.
Okay, so in the final chapter, Perón's tone completely shifts. He goes from defense to prophecy. And from exile, he issues this grim and honestly, chillingly detailed forecast for Argentina's future under the new military government.
He does not hold back. He uses this really powerful metaphor to argue that military rule is just inherently corrupt and unstable. He sees it as a system that's completely doomed to fail from the top down, led by men who, in his view, only understand force, not how to actually govern a country.
And he predicts, with this eerie certainty, that they will systematically destroy everything that he built. He sees a future of foreign debt, the end of social programs, skyrocketing unemployment, and the return of an old, wealthy oligarchy. And it will all lead, he prophesies, to their own violent end. And then, finally, he addresses the moment he was kicked out of power, and he reframes the entire event. It wasn't a defeat, he says. It wasn't cowardice. It was a noble sacrifice. He insists that he chose exile to spare the nation that he loved from a bloody and devastating civil war. And all of this leaves us with a final, really interesting question. When a leader is thrown out of power, their story, their narrative, that becomes their last and maybe their most important battleground. Perón's book is just this powerful reminder that the story of what actually happened is a prize that's fought over long after the real struggle for power is finished.